Ladies and gentlemen, the program will begin shortly. Good day. Welcome to Advocacy Anywhere, powered by AJC. Advocacy Anywhere is AJC's digital platform that enables you to engage with AJC's global expertise, content, and advocacy from wherever you are. Today's program is brought to you in partnership with AJC Access, AJC's Young Professional Network, and Jewish Insider. You can sign up for Jewish Insider's daily kickoff by visiting www.jewishinsider.com. Joining us today is Peter Stern, Director, Content Policy Stakeholder Engagement at Facebook, the world's largest social media platform. For years, AJC staff in the United States and globally have engaged with leaders from Facebook to address growing concerns around controversial or harmful content, including anti-Semitic hate speech. Today's conversation will be moderated by Holly Huffnagel, AJC U.S. Director, Combating Anti-Semitism, and will highlight what Facebook is doing to counter hate speech and address the ever-present misinformation around the coronavirus. After we hear from Peter, we will take your questions. You may email your question to questions@ajc.org. That's questions plural. Holly, Peter, you have the floor.
Thank you, Daniel. And hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this timely discussion. AJC was actually reminded yesterday of just how timely this conversation is. We discovered that this very session was targeted to be Zoom bombs, that there are bad actors who don't even want us to have this conversation. So Peter, thank you for being with us today, because it is important that we have it. So our topic today is hate and misinformation online. This is a very complex topic. There aren't easy answers because often the issues themselves are very complex. And what do I mean? We can just look at the complexity of anti-Semitism, for example. Today, anti-Semitism comes from many different sources: the far right, the far left, Islamist extremists. It still comes from Christian anti-Judaism, from Holocaust denial and distortion. And if there is one place where all of these sources exist together, it's the internet. And that really leads me into my first question, Peter. Is that the biggest and the fastest growing source of anti-Semitism, of hate, misinformation today is found online and on social media. And so I want to actually start with misinformation, and then we can move into online hate. So Peter, can you first define for us the difference between misinformation and disinformation? And then what is Facebook doing to address this issue in general? And what are the steps that you're taking?
Sure. Thanks very much, Holly. And before we dive in, let me say how happy I am to be here. This is part of an ongoing dialogue we have with AJC and its peer organizations. We have really good relationships and lines of communication open with Julie Raymond, Avi Meir, others in your organization, and we meet with them regularly to talk about the kinds of issues that we're going to be discussing today. So it's something that's really valuable to us, and I'm really appreciative of the relationship. I'm a lawyer by training. I've been at Facebook for almost 6 years. And I'm part of what we call the content policy team. That's the team that creates the community standards, our advertising policies, as well as other policies that are relevant to what we're going to be talking about today in areas such as misinformation, certain types of specific products that come out on Facebook, trying to keep a balance between voice and safety. So let me take your questions in sort of step by step here. You asked initially about the distinction between disinformation and misinformation, and that's a good place to start. I think it's helpful to be clear on that because sometimes those terms are used kind of loosely. So let me say a bit about how we approach those two things. Disinformation is characterized by an intention to mislead. This is something that we approach under our policies, most typically through something we call coordinated inauthentic behavior. And we regularly put out reports on how we're handling coordinated inauthentic behavior. This tends to be characterized by the use of pages or accounts to convey the misimpression that about the source of the information or about the intent behind the information. So some of the news reports that you've undoubtedly read about attempts to interfere with elections, attempts to create other kinds of misperceptions about social discord fall under the heading of what we call coordinated inauthentic behavior. The content itself is not necessarily false. It is content that could, in other circumstances, be part of a legitimate public dialogue. But in the cases that we're talking about, where it's being used by people who are taking advantage of fake accounts or are otherwise trying to mislead people about their intent, we attack that as a problem separate from its content. And we have a security team that deals with that, looking at signals and ways of tracing accounts and information that candidly are above a technical level that I deal with every day. But there is a team that's very, very focused on that around election issues and other types of concerns. Turning to misinformation, in that context, we don't have the intention to mislead. And so this may be the forwarding of content that is false, but not necessarily done with any intent to affect public opinion, public discourse. It's done by people who perhaps don't know any better, are mistaking opinion for something that presents itself as false information. And there we do have a variety of levers that we try to use to deal with this, because we don't want false information or harmful content to circulate on the platform. Would it be useful for me to talk about some of those buckets of policies under which we address misinformation, or do you want to raise it?
Yes, if you could just quickly mention those few, and then I want to move on and asking like how COVID-19 and this current crisis has actually affected,
Sure.
Those mechanisms, and if it's making
Sure.
your work more difficult, given the fact that there are more actually extremists online, mobilizing, spreading this misinformation. So that would be wonderful, Peter. Thank you.
Right. Well, in the COVID context, we're not necessarily creating new policies, but we are seeking to apply existing policies in this moment of crisis. And we're looking at our policies literally on a daily basis to determine whether we are in the right place, whether we're keeping up with events. So let me talk about two big subheadings here. The first is what we call misinformation and harm. This is a type of misinformation, false information, that presents a risk of real-world imminent harm. Now, this is a policy approach that we developed a couple of years ago, intended originally for places like Myanmar or Sri Lanka, where you had certain types of conflict and the leveraging of rumors and false information in a way that could really put people at risk. And we determined that in that setting, we should remove content that we're able to determine meets our policy threshold. The second type of misinformation that we deal with doesn't involve a risk of imminent harm. And in this case, what we've tried to do is work with an international fact-checking network to develop a mechanism for identifying information that is false and then downranking it, making it less available in newsfeed, and taking additional steps, putting warning labels around it that are visible to people when they look at the article, when they try to share it, if they've already shared it. And on Instagram, we take it out of recommendation services like Explore, like Explore or hashtags. So we're trying to prevent this content from doing damage through virality without removing it from the platform.
Right, and this de-emphasizing it, it's kind of that adage, right? That free speech is not free reach, right? So you're trying to lessen the reach of this misinformation to the users.
That's right. Now, both of these types of misinformation approach play out in the COVID context.
And do you have, like, you mentioned this international fact-checking network, do you have third-party fact checkers that their job has been made more difficult, actually, because they aren't together, they aren't working in a, you know, in the same building, they're at home trying to do their work. What has that been like?
Right, that's an interesting question. I mean, these are independent experts in fact-checking. They're out there in 60 countries covering 50 plus languages. They're not Facebook employees, so they're not affected by some of the changes that Facebook has had to implement to deal with the crisis, and maybe we can talk about. Many of them are spread out. They're independent experts. So it's a little bit hard for me to speak to that in detail, but their role, I think, is more important than ever.
Absolutely, absolutely. I actually want to. We might come back to the COVID piece and what Facebook in particular has had to deal with. But I want to turn now to speaking specifically to online hate and extremism. And I know in the beginning of the advent, right, of social media companies, you know, 15 or so years ago, there was this hope that these platforms would be like the marketplace of ideas, right, where the best ideas would rise to the surface. Yet this didn't always happen. You know, in providing this forum to bring communities together, we now know that the platforms inadvertently, but have helped nurture hate and violence and extremism. So can you, Peter, just help inform our audience, like how Facebook's moderating harmful speech, maybe specifically in the United States context, which is kind of the tricky issue within this free speech framework, you know, preserving freedom of expression, which is really the core of our democracy?
Sure, sure. That notion of sort of pure, unregulated speech has never been our approach. I mean, I've been at Facebook for 6 years, and certainly well before I arrived, we had policies and we enforced them, and we took issues of hate extremely seriously. And it really is tied to our mission of building community and bringing people together. Because we know that although free expression has always been and will continue to be a core value for us, really paramount among our values, if we don't make sure that people feel safe on the platform, they won't come to the platform, and we won't be able to accomplish our mission. So we're really just as much concerned about the freedom of expression of the people who might be inhibited or deterred from coming to Facebook through ineffective enforcement, as we are about having a robust dialogue on the platform. Now, you mentioned, I think, changes over time. Even though in many ways the core values have remained consistent, there have been a lot of changes. I think there are a couple things one could point to. We're certainly more detailed now and more public about our policies. We disclosed the community standards in full about 2 years ago. That has led to a lot of really good dialogue, because now we can talk to people in much more detail about why we've drawn lines in certain places. In terms of developing policies, you know, that's a big part of what my overall team does. And my specific role is to conduct engagement with groups like AJC to get input and expertise so that we can try to make our policies as nuanced and sensitive and comprehensive as possible. We're definitely not going to be able to make everybody happy all the time. The community is too large and diverse for that, but we can hear those voices and reflect those concerns in our process. And then the third big thing that people should know about is the move over time, which I think is going to continue, is from a position of reactive to proactive enforcement. As you know, in the status quo scenario, people can report content to us that they're concerned about, and we'll take a look at it. But we're also now much more active in using artificial intelligence to flag content that we think either should be removed outright because we have a very high confidence that it violates our policies, or to direct it to reviewers to take a look at. And you know, we're going to be next week releasing some numbers on this. We do this on a regular basis. And if you look at the total of hate speech that we have removed, we're now at a point where almost 90% of it has been identified by us to begin this process of review. That's a good development, because it means that we're able to remove content more often before anybody has to see it.
I see. That's very helpful. Actually, I want to pick up quickly on the artificial intelligence piece. you have a sense of how effective AI is? Is it getting what we need for, for it to get? Is it, for instance, I know working in the at AJC, often, we will post pictures of things that are happened and talk about how horrifying it is, that there's Holocaust denial, that there's, anti-Semitism. Is AI smart enough to know that a good actor is posting about something bad that's happened versus seeing, the swastika or seeing the image and taking it down?
That is our goal.
Okay.
We don't always succeed, but I think we're getting better. In some circumstances, we're able to determine with a high degree of certainty that a piece of content is likely to violate. If you look at something like an ISIS flag with no commentary around it, that tells us that this is something that probably violates, and we're probably comfortable removing it. In other circumstances, we have less confidence. Linguistic issues loom very large, and we recognize that AI is not perfect. That's why we tend to use AI in those gray areas to flag content for people to take a look at. The other point that you make about the use of counterspeech or the drawing attention to hate symbols to condemn or draw awareness is very important. And I know AJC has done a lot of work in this area with the Je suis là campaign, and it's a big focus, as it is for us and as it should be. So whatever we do, we have to leave room for that.
Absolutely, thank you. And you spoke about our AJC Paris's counter speech example, our Je suis là, and we have other offices around the world as a global organization, really able to tackle these issues in the places they occur, because obviously the laws in these countries are very different. Facebook in Europe is going to be dealing with different issues even than here. I want to just go back quickly to this shift we were talking about, like how it's going from reactive to proactive. And yesterday there was a launch of Facebook's new Oversight board, which is just really recent news. Do you mind telling us a little bit about this Oversight board, who's on it, what they're going to be doing? I mean, this is exciting.
Sure, thank you. It is exciting. And yesterday was a big day for the team, including me, that's been involved with this. This kicked off maybe a year and a half ago, and this was coming from the highest levels of our management. We wanted to come up with a way to share some of the weighty responsibility that we have for determining content policy decisions on the platform. And so what we've done is create an independent board that ultimately will consist of about 40 members. Yesterday we announced the first slate of 20 that will be responsible for reviewing some of the most difficult and contentious content policy issues that Facebook has to deal with. Facebook has gotten the ball rolling and has funded a trust that will then be responsible for paying the salary and administrative expenses of the Oversight Board. The members of the Oversight Board will take a small number of cases, maybe ultimately around 50 or so cases per year, perhaps more as time goes on, either by way of a secondary appeal from people who use Facebook, or from the Facebook policy department, where we think that there's an issue that's extremely complex and we'd like the views of this outside board. Now, what's really important to emphasize is that the decisions of the board will be binding. And whatever the board decides, if they say we got it wrong and we have to restore content or remove content, we'll abide by that. The board is also empowered to give us policy guidance. They may say, Facebook, you should change the decision here, and then you should consider doing X, Y, and Z. That element of their work won't be binding on us, but we will take it very seriously, and we will be responsible for responding to it in a public way. So there'll be this idea of a kind of a public conversation between Facebook and an independent board consisting of some very high-powered individuals, law professors, a Nobel Peace Prize winner, and also Emmy Palmer, who's a former high-ranking member of the Israeli Ministry of Justice. We're very pleased that we have an Israeli on the board. So there's a lot more to come, but it's exciting, and we feel it's the right step.
Thank you. Actually, I think you being on AJC's Advocacy Anywhere platform today and sharing that with us, we're almost hearing the news before it's released. So thank you for sharing that with us. Before we turn to questions from our audience, I actually really want to focus on anti-Semitism for one moment. We know, at least anecdotally, that in the past 6-7 weeks, I mean, who knows where we are really in the pandemic, there's been an uptick in anti-Semitism online. Much of the anti-Semitic content is connected to COVID-19, where Jews or the state of Israel have been blamed for either creating the virus, for profiting off the anecdote. I mean, the problematic list goes on, right? So when it comes to moderating anti-Semitism on Facebook, this is like the big question, right? How does the company like determine what is taken down, and then what actually stays up, or what needs to stay up, and where is that line? And I know that's a tough one, but I know our audience is interested in anti-Semitism in particular and Facebook's response.
Sure, let me try to address that in the COVID context.
Okay, perfect.
I think the most direct way to talk about this is by discussing our policy on hate speech. We don't have a policy that is specifically directed to anti-Semitism. We have discussed with AJC and many of its peer groups the IHRIA definition of anti-Semitism, and we've kind of mapped that onto our own policies. And there's not a perfect fit, but there's a great deal of overlap. So let me explain what our hate speech policies cover. Under our policies, we identify a number of what we call protected characteristics: race, ethnicity, national origin, and a number of others. And under our policies, we don't allow content that attacks members of protected characteristics. Now, an attack could be a dehumanizing characterization, a derogatory reference, a call for exclusion or segregation. So in the context of COVID, the way this plays out is we don't allow people to post content that attacks members of protected characteristics by saying that they have the virus, are spreading the virus, or created the virus. So under our policies, Jews created COVID would be removed as a violation of hate speech. We have created a carve-out, particularly in the COVID context, for national origin. Ordinarily, national origin is a protected characteristic. You can't say, I hate people from such and such country. In the COVID context, and this has been a very difficult issue for us, but in the COVID context, we've determined that it's important that people be able to talk about the disease and the spread of the disease in terms that are touching on nations and national origin. Okay. So we think, for example, that it should be okay for people to say, 65% of Italians have the virus. If we applied the policy without the carve-out, that would not be allowed. We don't think that's the right place. So we've tried to come up with a nuanced approach in this situation. Now that may change as time goes on. We'll have to continue to re-examine it, but that's our approach. There are a couple other wrinkles, but that's the gist of it.
Well, that's helpful. And do you mind if I just kind of circle back to the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism? One of the reasons why this definition was created was the recognition that there were new forms of anti-Semitism, that it was no longer on the far right, the neo-Nazis, the easily identifiable folks, right? It was coming in new places, especially with conspiracy theories and related to the state of Israel, which was that touchy piece. But we see the line being crossed where Jews were being blamed for Israeli actions, and synagogues in Europe were being firebombed because of something that was happening in the Middle East, and that was incredibly inappropriate and anti-Semitic, and that was really kind of the genesis of this definition. Do you see this? I mean, you mentioned it as a helpful resource for your work. Do you think other social media platforms can benefit from this tool? It's not legally binding in any way. How do you see it fitting into helping Facebook, maybe the human monitors, even AI, be able to better recognize what is anti-Semitic on your platform?
It is helpful. It's been a useful spur for many discussions that we've had with AJC and other groups. So yes, we have found it to be valuable. I mean, I think the areas where we would depart to some degree from that definition, I want to be candid with you, comes in relation to statements about particularly nations. Our policy, our hate speech policy, seeks to protect people. So we don't allow people to make certain types of hateful statements against individuals. If the focus turns to a country, an institution, a philosophy, then we allow people to express themselves more freely, because we think that that's an important part of political dialogue, and that there's an important legitimate component to that. So we allow people to criticize the state of Israel as well as the United States and other countries. I mean, the IRIA definition calls that out and excludes certain of that speech, but I did want to draw attention to that important approach in the way that we handle the issue.
No, thank you, Peter. And again, it's a part of an ongoing dialogue as we try to better push back against rising anti-Semitism, not just online but offline as well. I'm going to take this time actually to turn it over to our audience for questions, and then we can hear more from you, Peter, from our audience. So Daniel, I turn it over to you now.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Holly. I have a few coronavirus-related questions that I'll start with, and I'll throw a couple of them out there if that's okay. Our first from Jill in New York was asking that what measures or features, if any, has Facebook adopted specifically during the coronavirus crisis regarding misinformation surrounding the disease itself and online hate towards the Asian American community at large? And sort of on the same lines with coronavirus is on misinformation and the coronavirus. This is from Eilis O'Keefe. Does the rapidly changing context and things happening so constantly in the news make fact-checking on this topic more difficult?
Okay, those are all good questions. In terms of our approach to misinformation, specifically in relation to COVID, I mentioned the two buckets that we have: misinformation and harm, and then misinformation where there isn't a risk of physical harm. Both of those policies have been enforced very actively. In terms of the former, because of the nature of harm posed by the virus, either people exposing themselves to harm or potentially infecting others, this notion of harm has a significant scope to it. And so we will remove content that, for example, says that certain types of cures are available to deal with the virus. Garlic cures the virus, or that there are ways to prevent the virus. Going out in strong sunlight can ensure that you don't catch the virus. Or the idea that you could determine whether or not you have COVID by, standing on one foot and counting backwards from 10 to 1. Those types of content, because they could lead people into behavior that would put themselves and others at risk, we'll remove that under our misinformation and harm policy. Under the second approach, we have downranked content that has been debunked by third-party fact checkers, and there's a broad range of stuff, as I'm sure you know, theories that are not well grounded about the origin of the virus, or about the potential for cures, and where third-party fact checkers have identified that content as false, we'll take the steps that I mentioned. And there's quite a big impact to the work that we've done on that, because we've been able to start with articles, sources of information that the fact checkers have debunked, and then move out to duplicates to cast a broader net. So in March, we reported that the third-party fact checkers identified about 4,000 articles as having been false. That led, however, to the flagging and downranking of 40 million posts on Facebook. So this does have a significant impact on what people are seeing on the platform. In terms of Asian Americans, the second part of your question, that's really handled under the hate speech approach that I mentioned. Attacks on Asians or statements that they have the virus would be covered by that policy.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Shrub Kempner in Galveston, Texas. You had mentioned you were talking about the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism, and he's wondering if it would make your work any more productive if Congress, the U.S. Congress, passed the working definition of anti-Semitism.
It's a little hard for me to look that far ahead. You know, I think we're deeply engaged with that definition and with people who have encouraged us to take it on board. And so, you know, I think we're already getting significant benefit from it, even though we recognize that in those discussions, we're not always going to agree with the people with whom we're engaging. And, you know, I said that we don't have a policy on anti-Semitism, and we don't specifically, but that doesn't mean that we're not keenly aware of issues of history and the realities of what goes on offline and online on our platform. And let me give you one example. Last year, we kicked off a process. We became concerned that there were certain types of stereotypes that were being employed on the platform that could be harmful. And even if they didn't seem that way on the surface. And so we kicked off a process of talking to academics and other thought leaders about how stereotypes work, how they draw on historical references, how they may ease the path to violence in some cases, and came up with a policy on harmful stereotypes, which we're now in the process of finalizing and enforcing. And one of the elements of this, it has to do with the notion that Jews rule the world or run the world. And so as this was one of the first elements of this policy that we rolled out, because we recognized that it met the criteria that we developed and was potentially a significant concern on the platform. So that's the kind of thing that we will be looking for, because after a lot of consideration, we've determined that that's the right thing to do for our community.
Thank you. This next question comes from Marcia Bloomberg in New Jersey. She asked, it seems that extremists and hate mongers feel safe online. What is Facebook doing to eliminate their sense that this is a place to espouse their views? And Janice Ellen in Atlanta has had a similar question asking about negative consequences for those that spread disinformation.
Right. Yeah, I didn't mention this, but we also have a strong approach towards what we call dangerous organizations, which could be organizations that are dedicated to hate, that espouse terrorism. In addition to removing individual pieces of content from the platform, we also have an approach whereby we analyze whether certain groups meet our criteria to be kicked off of Facebook. And this is something that we regularly do. We ban groups from Facebook, and then this is an important step, a powerful step, because once a group is banned from Facebook, we don't allow anyone on the platform to praise it or support it. So once we've designated a group like this, you can't say, I love this group, I support them, I'm a member. So we're seeking to really cast a broader net and get rid of that stuff at the root. Now, candidly, it is our major challenge, because these groups are inventive. This is an adversarial process. We're constantly learning about new code words, new ways that they have for seeking to abuse the platform, but it's a major focus of the company to try and stop that.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Eric in Berlin. Germany's past has made it especially sensitive to hate speech. A 2018 law required large social media platforms to take down posts that are manifestly illegal under criteria set out in German law within 24 hours. This obviously differs from country to country, but from your vantage point, what lessons can be learned from the German position on hate speech?
Sure. I made a number of trips to Berlin last year. So I know the people in our office there very well, and I've definitely discussed this issue with them. They're the experts on NetzDG. You know, we, as a company, had some concerns about potential overreaching aspects of the law, and we regularly put out public numbers on the number of reports that we're receiving and how we've actioned those numbers under the law. That's in addition to all of our policies. I mean, I think what I would say is that sometimes people, including people in Germany, are surprised at how comprehensive our policies are, and a lot of the content that they think might not be covered actually is covered. So I think one would want to ask that question before examining the need or the efficacy of a law like an NetzDG. But obviously we comply with local law and we've met our obligations under that. And we also, I think this is important to say, in a country like France and Germany, where speech laws are stricter in some respects, we comply with those laws. And when we identify content that violates local law, we'll make it unavailable in that country while allowing it to be seen by people in other parts of the world.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Jesse in Maryland. Facebook, Twitter, and others took considerable heat during the 2016 election regarding fake news. What has Facebook done to improve on those since then? And how much of this overlaps with the issues relating to hate speech?
Sure. Since the election, there has been a huge amount of effort directed to misinformation and to securing elections more generally. We haven't really touched on that. It's the work of additional teams, but that is also a huge focus for the company. And I can tell you that there are many people seeking to ensure that 2020 goes smoothly in the United States. There's just no priority that's more important for the company than that. I mean, I think in terms of hate speech, it all ties in. We try to have a consistent policy approach, and there's some ways in which the rules that we have regarding elections do have a direct bearing on, are found in our community standards. I can give you one example. Around elections, we don't allow people to misrepresent the date of polling or the qualifications required for voting, other things that might deter people from voting. So sometimes we have seen, for example, posts or events that say, you know, there's voting for this group on this day, but the voting for members of the other political party is actually 2 days later. So we won't allow that, because under our policies we'll remove that, because that could prevent people from exercising their right to vote. And I think similarly, if somebody posted, you know, you have to get your temperature taken for COVID purposes before you get into the polling place, I think we would remove that.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Jeremiah, who's the Access Global co-chair in Washington, D.C. He's asking if you can comment on two recent news items. The first being, they're both connected. The first being that Facebook says that it was dismantling disinformation network tied to Iran state media, and Facebook closing Iranian Supreme Leader Khamenei's page.
Sure. The first thing that you mentioned, that's an example of our work in the area of coordinated inauthentic behavior. Candidly, I'm not the best person to give you details on that. I'm sure that we have disclosed those in a blog post. We put those out every month or every other month. I can get you that if that's of interest to you. I know there have been a number of actions involving Iran. And the other thing that you mentioned, you know, if there is a designated hate figure, such as a terrorist leader, who is the subject of praise or support, then we would remove that under the policy that you mentioned. I'm not 100% sure of the details regarding that figure, but I believe that the policy was implicated.
Our next question comes from Jonathan Levine in Evanston, Illinois, who asks, one charge already leveled at Facebook is that its oversight board is being made up of people who are too nice and will not raise a little hell when necessary. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Well, I hope that's not true, because the function of the oversight board is to provide real oversight, to be independent, to, I mean, look, if the board isn't fulfilling its mandate to provide a check and a way of taking up some of the responsibility that we feel it's appropriate for us to share, then it's not really fulfilling its mandate, and no one is happy. I'm sure the members of the board will not be happy. And, you know, the board is independent, so they will be in charge of this process going forward, but that wouldn't be consistent with our design for the overall project. I mean, I have to say, if you look at the people who are on the board, they do not look like a bunch of shrinking violets to me. And that's, you know, they went through an extensive, I'm being a little bit facetious, but I do want to make a point that we tried to choose people who were deeply committed to freedom of expression, who would be collegial in a setting like this and able to talk to each other and hash things out. And they're going to be deciding in cases of 5, panels of 5, as well as on occasion as a larger body. And we wanted people precisely who would be committed to building the board as an institution. You know, we started with the co-chairs, 4 co-chairs, and then worked with them to bring in other members after an extensive vetting process. And now going forward, the board will have a committee that is going to be responsible for bringing in additional people. So it's going to be very exciting to see how it plays out, but we think it's a really positive step.
Thank you, Peter. We've received a couple questions on this topic. The TPP review published on April 22nd found 125 Facebook groups devoted to the, quote, boogaloo, the term that far-right extremists use to describe a coming civil war. Many of these groups are anti-Semitic, racist, and xenophobic. What actions, besides just monitoring these groups, has Facebook taken? Why has Facebook not been more aggressive when removing these groups?
Right. I'm familiar with that code word, and it's something that we're watching very carefully. I mean, I think as in many areas of our policies, we look at developments and we map those developments onto our policies, keeping in mind that we want to keep hate and violence off the platform while allowing room for legitimate debate. And the question is, where do we draw the line? So we're constantly in the position of doing our research, both in terms of looking at offline behavior, which often leads us to talk to groups like AJC and others who have expertise in this area, and looking at patterns of behavior on the platform. You know, what types of sharing is going on, what types of membership are we seeing? We're really trying to dig in, and in many cases, for example, if we remove one group, we'll sort of fan out and look at what the network of connections is, and what does that lead us to conclude about the way that people may be supporting hate on the platform. So what I can tell you is that we're very aware of this situation, and it's something that we're looking at very closely, and we'll take appropriate action when we think that the line has been crossed.
Great. I have one final question for you, Peter, before turning it back over to you, Holly. Shani in Paris asked, Facebook is currently developing its artificial intelligence capabilities. Will moderation by robots gradually replace human moderation? If so, is there a risk of missing out some of the more subtle hateful messages?
I think you make a very good point, and many members of civil society have expressed this concern to us. I think you see us trying to be deliberate in our application of AI for exactly the reason that you point to. We want to leverage it to the fullest extent that we can, because it helps us get rid of stuff without people having to see it and report it to us. We would like to be in the position of removing as much as we can through the use of AI. But we know that it's possible to go too far. And you think, for example, of something like slurs, bad words that people use about each other, that many of which have a lot of historical weight behind them. There are many, many cases in which a term will be used self-referentially. Language changes over time. Some of these slurs have been adopted by the original target groups, and so now they're kind of celebrated. They're part of a positive ethos, and we don't want to take that off the table, because that seems like a step backward. So to get back to your question, in all of these areas, we're just trying to think it through really carefully and be as impactful as we can in using AI without sacrificing values of expression, particularly for communities who may feel that they are targeted or vulnerable and who otherwise don't have a voice.
Peter, thank you for in the very least complicating our understanding of Facebook and what you're doing. And maybe we have more questions, higher order questions at the end of this conversation, which is okay. We're learning in this process. So I just want to close by saying that AJC appreciates that Facebook is taking these issues seriously. Of course, we encourage the platform to continue to bolster these efforts to prevent hate and misinformation. But AJC is grateful to you, Peter, in particular, as a good faith partner with us in this process. So on behalf of AJC, thank you for your time and your insights today. And Daniel, I now turn it back to you.
Thank you, Peter. Yeah, thank you, Peter, and thank you, Holly. And thanks to our partners at Jewish Insider. I also want to thank our audience for joining us and for showing your commitment to the topics discussed here today. In these unique times, while so many of us are separated from our family and friends, AJC is bringing us together on the issues that matter most. Please consider making a donation to AJC so we can continue fighting anti-Semitism, hate, extremism, and all forms of racism and xenophobia. Visit ajc.org/donate. Our next Advocacy Anywhere program will be tomorrow, May 8th at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. On the eve of the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II, AJC CEO David Harris will recount the journey that took the Jewish people from the end of the Shoah, one of the darkest chapters in Jewish history, to the miraculous founding of the State of Israel. Not only has the late Shimon Peres referred to David Harris as the foreign minister of the Jewish people, President Bill Clinton in 2005 called David one of the best speakers he'd ever heard. You won't want to miss this program. Please stay safe and healthy, everyone. Thanks again, Peter. Bye.
Thank you.